I realized my wife wanted me locked up in a nursing home not because I was losing my mind but because I was standing in the way of her sleeping with another man. If I had not seen that document on the kitchen counter, she might have pulled it off. 50 years of marriage. Half a century. And she was ready to throw it all away for a man who wore cheap cologne and laughed like a television host. I found the form at 6:37 in the morning, just before my usual walk around the block. Same route I have walked for 15 years since I retired. It was lying flat on the counter, partly covered by the morning paper. The title read Petition for Conservatorship. My name was typed neatly at the top. Edward Franklin Palmer. It was her handwriting. I know it better than my own. The date was filled in. The boxes were checked. She was preparing to declare me mentally incompetent. I did not touch the paper. I just stood there. The coffee in my hand went cold. My heart did not speed up. It slowed down. It got heavy. Like something ancient shifted inside me. I listened to the coffee maker dripping behind me and knew right then that my life was no longer mine. At least not in her eyes. At 7:15 she walked into the kitchen like everything was normal. Her robe tied up neatly, her hair pinned like always. She smiled at me, kissed my cheek and poured herself coffee. She did not notice the document. I said nothing. I just watched her. The way her hands moved. How she did not look at me again after that kiss. We have been married since 1974. I met Judith in a diner where she worked nights and I had just gotten out of the army. She was beautiful back then, with long black hair, a sharp tongue and a laugh that could stop a room. We raised 3 kids, paid off 2 mortgages, buried a dog, and argued about politics every week. She was my partner. My best friend. And now she was getting ready to take away everything I had left. I went on my walk like always. But I did not see the sidewalk or the houses. I saw her. The way she looked last month when she returned from her church retreat in Arizona. Tanned, glowing like someone had flipped a switch inside her. I remembered her late night calls when she whispered things like, "He is asleep," or "I will call you when I can." I remembered how she forgot our anniversary for the first time in 49 years. I did not want to believe it. Even after I saw the form. I tried to think maybe she was worried. Maybe she really believed I was slipping. I am 72, not dead. I still handle the bills. I still change the oil in the truck. I know the names of all the grandkids. But that handwriting told the truth. She was planning it. Calmly. Deliberately. With no guilt. At 10:30 I opened the cabinet in the garage where I keep our documents. I checked everything. Then I found another paper. Power of attorney. Same handwriting. Same date. Already notarized. Judith was going to take full control. I sat in the garage for 3 hours. No tools, no sound. Just me and that paper. At one point I laughed. I remembered something my father once said. The woman who can look you in the eye while planning your funeral is the one you married. He was joking back then. Now I was not so sure. That night I did not sleep. I lay beside her pretending to rest. I listened to her shallow breathing. I thought about all the years. All the holidays I missed. All the meals I paid for. The double shifts. Her smile. And how long it had been since she really looked at me. And I made a decision. Quiet. Cold. Final. She thought she was the only one playing the long game. She was wrong. The next morning I woke up before the sun. Not that I slept. I just laid there in bed staring at the ceiling fan spinning slow and steady like time was mocking me. Judith was still asleep beside me, her mouth slightly open, her breath shallow and calm like someone without a single burden in the world. I watched her for a full hour. She didn't move. Not once. Like she had already locked me away in her mind. By 6 I was dressed and out in the garage again. Same paper still sitting there. Power of attorney. Her signature perfect like always. My name at the bottom blank. Waiting. She probably thought she'd get me to sign it by pretending it was something for our health insurance or our taxes. And if I refused? I wondered if she had a backup plan. A forged signature. A doctor friend willing to say I was declining. I wasn't going to wait to find out. I pulled out the folder with our joint accounts. I made copies of every bank statement going back 5 years. I scanned property deeds, the titles to both vehicles and the pension distribution forms. Everything I ever kept hidden in that locked drawer. Then I packed them in a plain brown envelope and drove straight to my friend Martin's house. Martin served with me in Vietnam. We hadn't talked much since his stroke 2 years ago, but I knew one thing about Martin. He hated liars. And he knew how to sniff them out. He opened the door with a cane in one hand and a cigarette already lit in the other. His left side still dragged a little, but the eyes were sharp. He looked at the envelope, then at me, and just said one word. Judith. I nodded. We sat in his den where it always smelled like coffee and old leather. I told him everything. The document, the changes in her behavior, the late night calls. The trip to Arizona where she came back acting like she was 20 again. And how I found not just one but 2 legal forms with my name on them and not a word from her. Martin didn't interrupt. He just listened. Nodded sometimes. Smoked 3 cigarettes in a row. When I finished, he leaned forward and tapped the envelope. You trust me with this? I said yes without hesitation. Then you do exactly what I tell you, he said. That afternoon he called a contact of his, a woman named Beverly who used to work as a clerk in the county court office. She knew how to search public records without leaving a digital trail. Within 2 hours she called back with information that made my stomach turn. Judith had opened a separate savings account 3 months ago. Not in both our names. Just hers. And there were 2 large deposits into it. One from our main account. The second from a cashier's check issued out of Tucson, Arizona. From someone named Mark Everett Dawson. I had never heard of him. But I would. That night I acted like nothing happened. Ate dinner with her like always. She made meatloaf with that store-bought gravy I hate, but I smiled and said it tasted fine. She asked me how my walk was. I said peaceful. She kissed my cheek like she had that morning after leaving paperwork that would turn me into a prisoner in my own life. And then she told me. I think we should go on a little trip next weekend. Just the 2 of us. Get some sunshine. Arizona maybe. I felt my hand clench around the fork. Arizona. Of course. She smiled like it was spontaneous. Like she hadn't rehearsed it in front of a mirror 20 times. But her eyes. They looked past me. Like she was already gone. I asked her where in Arizona. Oh, I don't know, she said. Somewhere nice. Maybe near Tucson. I hear they have those retirement communities with golf and spas and all that. You'd love it. I nodded. Played dumb. Said it sounded relaxing. But inside I was burning. The next morning I drove to Beverly's office myself. I asked her to dig deeper into Mark Dawson. She agreed. 2 days later I had a full report in my hands. He was 61. Divorced. Former real estate broker. Lost his license in 2017 for fraud. Had lived in Tucson for the last 5 years. Filed for bankruptcy twice. And had a history of charming older women and convincing them to invest in real estate deals that never existed. He was a predator. And now he was sleeping with my wife. I didn't need confirmation, but I got it anyway. Beverly traced his phone number. Matched it to Judith's call log. There were over 70 calls in the last 2 months. Some at 2 or 3 in the morning. She wasn't just cheating. She was conspiring. That night I didn't pretend to sleep. I sat in the living room with a cold cup of coffee and watched the shadows move across the floor as the moon came through the blinds. My hands didn't shake. My mind was clear. Judith thought I was old, tired, slow. She thought I'd never figure it out. She thought I would sign anything she put in front of me. But I was done being quiet. And I was done being kind. She wanted a game. Now she had won. And I don't lose games. The following day I went to the bank alone. I told Judith I was going to the hardware store to get something for the sink. She didn't ask questions. She was too busy texting someone on her phone, probably Mark. I watched her from the doorway for a few seconds before leaving. She didn't even look up. That was the moment I stopped feeling married. At the bank I asked to speak with our manager, a young guy named Carlos. He had been handling our account for years. Knew us as the sweet old couple who came in together to ask simple questions about interest rates and certificates of deposit. I told him I needed to update access on our joint accounts. He smiled politely and asked why. I told him my wife was planning something without my knowledge and that I needed full control until I could speak with a lawyer. I showed him the photocopies. The petition for conservatorship. The power of attorney. His smile faded. Carlos wasn't allowed to give legal advice, but he could freeze activity temporarily on accounts flagged for potential fraud. He did exactly that. Every account with both our names on it was locked down until further notice. I signed the forms and walked out of the bank lighter than I had felt in weeks. She wasn't going to take a damn cent from me without a fight. On the way home I stopped at Martin's again. He was already sitting outside with his dog, a fat beagle named Duke who barked like a smoker and hated mailmen. I handed Martin a flash drive. It had every copy of the documents, phone logs, photos, and Beverly's research. I told him to keep it somewhere safe, just in case anything happened to me. He looked at me for a long time before speaking. "You think she's capable of doing something to you?" I didn't answer. I didn't need to. He nodded once and put the drive in his coat pocket. That evening I started watching her closely. I didn't let on. I still made dinner. Still smiled. Still asked about her day. But inside I studied every word, every glance, every excuse. She started talking about downsizing, maybe selling the house, moving somewhere warm before winter set in. Arizona again. Always Arizona. She mentioned visiting friends we hadn't seen in years. Said she wanted to make new memories while we still had time. I listened. I nodded. And I smiled. Because I already knew what she was really planning. The old tactic of killing someone slowly by pretending to care. One night I checked her phone while she was in the shower. She had changed her passcode, of course. But I remembered the number she used when our first grandson was born. I tried it. It worked. Inside were dozens of messages from Mark. Nothing outright sexual. They were smarter than that. But there were phrases that said enough. "I can't wait to be with you every night. Soon, baby. Soon. He doesn't know a thing." She had sent pictures too. One of her smiling in front of the mirror in a dress I had bought her for our 35th anniversary. She told him it made her feel alive again. I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at that screen for a long time. I didn't feel heartbreak. I didn't feel anger. I felt something colder. Like a wire had been cut inside me. I took screenshots. forwarded everything to a private email I had set up the day before. Then I deleted the sent messages and put the phone back where I found it. The next morning I started the next phase. I went to a law firm downtown. One that Martin's daughter recommended. I met with a divorce attorney named Susan Reynolds. Sharp eyes. Steel voice. No small talk. I liked her immediately. I laid everything out. The documents. The new account. The secret lover. The attempt to declare me incompetent. She listened quietly. Asked smart questions. Took notes. And then she said something that stuck with me. This isn't just a divorce. This is calculated abuse. And if you want to go on the offensive, I'm ready. I told her I did. She drew up a temporary restraining order, just in case. Began paperwork to protect my portion of assets. Opened a case to contest any future conservatorship attempt. And filed for legal separation with financial freeze. By the time I left her office, I had more than a plan. I had protection. I got home before Judith did. She had gone out to meet Linda for lunch. Linda had passed away 6 months ago from a stroke. I didn't mention it. Just smiled when she walked in and asked how her sandwich was. She lied with such ease it made my skin crawl. Over the next few days I built the case piece by piece. Martin helped. Beverly kept digging. Susan started preparing the full legal assault. And I waited. Waited for the moment she would try to spring it. And then, one morning, it came. She stood in the kitchen with 2 cups of coffee. Handed me one with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Said she needed me to look at a few documents. Just routine stuff. I took the coffee. I took the papers. And I looked her dead in the eyes and said, "You first." She froze when I said it. Just for a second. It was quick. Almost invisible. But I saw it. The flicker in her eyes. The way her fingers tightened around the coffee mug. Most people wouldn't have noticed. But after 50 years, I could read her like a weathered map. "You first," I repeated. She forced a laugh. Said something about how I was always so suspicious lately. She tried to brush it off, tried to pass the papers to me again. I didn't take them. I just looked at her and waited. Eventually she set them on the counter and picked up her cup like it was nothing. But she didn't drink. And she didn't smile anymore. That was the moment I knew she had no idea how much I already knew. I waited until she left the house to make her usual run to the pharmacy. Then I opened the folder she left behind. The top page was a fake consent form. It said I was voluntarily handing over financial management due to age-related memory decline. Nicely typed. With my name printed under the signature line. Blank. Still waiting for me. The second page was a medical statement. A draft, not signed yet. It claimed I had been experiencing confusion, misplacing items, forgetting familiar names and tasks. The usual garbage they use to build a case for conservatorship. It had a fake appointment date and a doctor's name I didn't recognize. I checked. The clinic was real. The doctor was real. But I had never met him. She was setting me up for a fall. I made photocopies of everything and locked the originals in my safe under the floorboards in the garage. The same place I used to keep my service pistol back in the day. These days the safe only held papers. But it felt like a weapon just the same. That night, I cooked dinner again. Roast chicken. Garlic potatoes. Judith acted normal, but she wasn't. Her movements were stiff, rehearsed. She talked too much about nothing. Tried too hard to laugh. I played along. Smiled. Poured wine. Asked about Arizona again. She lit up. Said it would be good for both of us. Relaxation. Sunshine. A fresh start. I asked if she already booked anything. She said not yet. I knew that was a lie. The next morning, I went back to Susan's office and showed her the documents Judith had tried to give me. Susan read them without a word. Then she looked up and said, "We need to move faster." She drafted a cease and desist letter to the doctor mentioned in the papers. It politely informed him he was being named in a potential fraud case if he allowed himself to be used in any false diagnosis without direct evaluation. She also requested copies of any files related to my name. Then Susan called a judge. By the end of the day, we had an emergency hearing scheduled for the following week. It would give me the legal grounds to challenge any conservatorship filing before it could be processed. A preemptive strike. Judith was still smiling at dinner that night. She had no clue the ground was shifting under her feet. But Mark did. The next morning I found an envelope shoved into our mailbox. No return address. Inside was a printed letter. Just one line. "Stop what you're doing or it gets ugly." No signature. No threat of violence. Just those words. But it was enough. I showed it to Martin. He read it once, then twice, and handed it back without a word. "He knows you're ahead of him," he finally said. "That makes you dangerous." I agreed. We started checking security cameras. Martin had one pointed toward my driveway from across the street. He rewound the footage from the night before. We saw a car pull up at 2:17 in the morning. A silver Lincoln. The license plate was partially visible. Martin called one of his old army buddies who worked for the DMV. By noon, we had a name. Mark Everett Dawson. Judith's lover. Her partner in this scheme. And now, apparently, the kind of man who leaves anonymous threats in mailboxes. I didn't tell Judith I knew. Not yet. I wanted her to keep pretending. To keep slipping. Because every time she lied, she gave me more rope to hang them both with. That night I sat on the porch with a glass of bourbon. She came out after a while and sat beside me. Asked if I was okay. Said I seemed distant. I told her I was just tired. She put her hand on my knee. I looked at it. For a moment I thought about all the years we held hands across tables, across hospital beds, across memories. Now her touch felt like ice. I told her I'd been thinking about the trip. She lit up again. Started talking about brochures, flights, all the places we could go. I asked her if Mark was coming with us. She went silent. Dead silent. Then she laughed. But it was wrong. Forced. Cold. "Who's Mark?" she asked. "You tell me," I said. "Or better yet, tell the judge next Thursday." Her face changed. It didn't fall apart. It didn't break. It hardened. Like steel cooling in open air. And that was when I knew. This wasn't just betrayal. This was war. Judith didn't speak for almost a full minute after I said the word judge. She just sat there on the porch, hand still resting on my knee, but the warmth gone from her fingers. Her eyes didn't blink. Her lips pressed into a thin line like she was holding something back. Not guilt. Not fear. Calculation. Finally she said, "I don't know what you think you've found, but you're making a mistake." I didn't answer. I just stood up and walked inside. Let her stew in silence. The next morning she was overly cheerful. Made pancakes, bacon, poured orange juice into a glass with a slice of orange on the rim like we were in some hotel buffet. She kissed my cheek again. Told me she loved me. Said things like we've had our ups and downs, but but I never stopped believing in us. It was a performance. And not a good one. By that point I had filed the motion to freeze joint assets and prevent property transfers without dual signatures. Susan had already begun the process of assigning a forensic accountant to our case. If Judith tried to move any more money, we would know. But I wasn't just defending myself anymore. I was going on offense. That same afternoon I drove to Tucson. Beverly had tracked down the address where Mark was living. A one-bedroom condo in a gated community for retirees. Clean, modern, expensive. Exactly the kind of place a man without a job shouldn't be able to afford. I parked across the street and waited. An hour later, I saw him. Tall, silver hair slicked back, sunglasses too dark for the cloudy day, wearing khakis and a polo like he was heading to a golf tournament that never existed. He had that walk, confident, careless, the kind of walk that came from a lifetime of getting away with things. I took pictures. Him leaving his condo. Him getting into the silver Lincoln. Him stopping by a boutique gym where he flirted with the receptionist. Him buying expensive wine at a liquor store using a black platinum credit card. Him pulling cash from an ATM. I sent everything to Susan. Then I followed him. Not close enough to spook him. Just enough to see where he went. And when he parked at a small office plaza with a fake consulting sign on the door, I made a note of the suite number and called Beverly again. By nightfall I had everything I needed. Mark wasn't just a con artist. He was an active fraudster using fake business fronts to launder money. Probably had Judith thinking she was investing in something real, when in fact, he was funneling funds straight to himself. Which meant she wasn't just a cheater. She was a mark. And that made things even more interesting. When I got home, Judith was waiting in the living room. No TV on. No lights except the one lamp near her chair. She looked tired. Or maybe just done pretending. We need to talk, she said. I sat down. She didn't waste time. I know you've been digging. I know you've been talking to people. And I know you think you're protecting yourself. I didn't respond. She kept going. But you're making this harder than it needs to be. We could have done this the easy way, ED. You could have had a quiet retirement. A warm place to live. I wasn't going to abandon you. I smiled. Small. Tight. You were just going to lock me up and live with your boyfriend on my pension. She didn't deny it. That's when I knew it was over. She stood up and walked toward the kitchen. For a second, I thought she was going to leave the room. Instead, she stopped at the table, picked up a stack of folded papers, and dropped them in front of me. Fine, she said. If this is how you want it, let's make it official. It was a divorce petition. Filed by her. Dated the day before. I read every line. She was asking for spousal support, half of all marital assets, and sole ownership of the house. She claimed I had shown signs of aggression, verbal instability, and paranoia. She was trying to flip the narrative before the hearing. I looked up and saw something strange in her eyes. Relief. Like this was what she wanted all along. Not reconciliation. Not forgiveness. But war. Controlled, strategic war. She wanted me to lose control. So I didn't. Instead, I folded the papers neatly, placed them back on the table, and said, "You'll get nothing." Her smile faded. "I mean it," I said. "Nothing. Not the house. Not the accounts. Not my name. You want war? You just stepped onto my battlefield." She laughed once. Bitter and sharp. "You too old for this." Maybe. But I've fought real enemies. Men with guns. Men who didn't blink. And I survived all of them. You just a cheap imitation. She walked out without another word. I sat in that room for a long time. Not because I was shaken, but because I was calculating my next move. The court date was in 5 days. And I wasn't going to wait. The 5 days leading up to the court hearing felt like a countdown to something bigger than war. Not a battle. A reckoning. Every morning I woke up at 5. Coffee. Shower. Then I sat in the garage with my old notebooks and copies of every document Susan had filed. I read them like they were blueprints for survival. Judith acted like nothing had changed. She made small talk about neighbors and grocery lists. She even offered to go with me to the hearing, said it was probably just a formality. Her eyes held that false innocence she used to get out of speeding tickets and overdue bills. But it didn't work on me anymore. Martin stopped by the day before the hearing. He brought me a fresh flash drive with everything backed up twice. Phone logs. Photos. Account history. And a new edition, recordings. He had wired his porch camera with audio. A few nights back, the Lincoln had pulled up again. Mark had stepped out and whispered something near the mailbox. The MIC picked up only part of it, but it was enough. He thinks he's winning. Let him. Once she signs the transfer, we're golden. It wasn't a confession. But it was close. Susan said it was admissible as circumstantial evidence, and paired with the financials, it could tear their story apart. That night I didn't sleep. Not out of fear. Out of focus. I stared at the ceiling, thinking about the way Judith smiled when we bought this house. The way she cried when our first grandchild was born. The way she looked at me once, 40 years ago, when I was laid up after a fall from a ladder. She told me I was her world back then. Now I was an obstacle. The morning of the hearing, I wore my best gray suit. Pressed shirt. Polished shoes. The same tie I wore to our daughter's wedding. Judith wore blue. Subtle. Elegant. A soft pearl necklace she hadn't touched in years. She looked like a grieving widow. We didn't speak on the drive. At the courthouse, Susan met me at the door. She was calm. Focused. Beside her was a younger associate carrying a thick binder. Beverly had emailed over last-minute findings. Apparently, Judith had attempted to transfer the title of our house into a trust with Mark listed as the secondary beneficiary. Without my signature. That was the crack we needed. Inside, the courtroom was quiet. Just a few rows of benches. A judge with gray hair and tired eyes. A court clerk typing without emotion. The other side had a lawyer too. A tall man in a blue suit who shook hands like he thought he was on TV. Judith sat beside him, hands folded, head tilted just slightly like she was the victim. The judge called it a preliminary hearing regarding potential conservatorship claims, financial dispute, and marital separation. He asked if there was intent to proceed with formal divorce. Judith's lawyer said yes. Susan said we would counterclaim fraud, coercion, and attempt to unlawfully seize marital property through deceit. The judge raised an eyebrow. Then it began. Susan presented our side clearly. She started with the documents Judith had left on the counter. The unsigned power of attorney. The drafted medical statements. She showed the screenshots of Mark's messages. The financial records. The recordings. Judith shifted in her seat. Her lawyer objected. Said it was circumstantial. Said the audio was incomplete. Said the messages could be taken out of context. Then Susan pulled out the title transfer. This was filed 2 days ago, Your Honor. Without Mr. Palmer's signature. In direct violation of joint property laws. It lists a Mr. Mark Everett Dawson as a successor in the event of Edward Palmer's death or incapacitation. The judge leaned forward. Judith's lawyer asked for a recess. Denied. The judge looked at Judith. Did you attempt to transfer this property without your husband's consent? She opened her mouth, closed it, then said, I thought he wouldn't understand what it meant. I wasn't trying to do anything wrong. The courtroom went silent. Susan leaned toward me and whispered, We've got her. The judge didn't issue a ruling that day. He set a formal hearing for 2 weeks later, but granted a temporary injunction on all shared assets. Neither party could make financial moves without joint approval. Outside, Judith didn't say a word. She walked past me like a stranger. But her lawyer stopped. He looked at me and said, You play dirty. I smiled. No. I play smart. When I got home that night, I stood in the living room and looked around the house we built. The walls we painted. The floorboards we laid by hand. I realized she didn't just want my money. She wanted my story. She wanted to rewrite it without me. But now it was my turn to write the final chapter. And it was going to end on my terms. The next morning I sat on the back porch with my coffee and thought about Mark Dawson. I thought about his fake smile, the smooth way he walked into other people's lives and walked out with everything they had. I pictured him sipping wine in his condo while Judith handled the dirty work. I pictured him laughing at me. An old man he thought was already finished. He was wrong. I called Beverly at 9. She answered on the first ring. I asked her to dig deeper into Mark's past. I wanted every business he ever registered, every complaint filed against him, every woman who filed a report or hired a lawyer. I told her I didn't care how far back it went. She said it would take time. Time was something I still had. I spent the next few days watching Judith closely. She barely spoke to me. The fake kindness was gone. Now there was silence. Ice. But she hadn't left. Not yet. Maybe she thought she could still win. Maybe she thought Mark had another plan. Or maybe she just didn't want to explain to our kids why she walked away right after filing for divorce. It didn't matter. She was still here, and that gave me the advantage. Susan called the following afternoon. She had reviewed the property trust filing again. Said it wasn't just suspicious, it was criminal if proven intentional. If we could show that Judith and Mark coordinated the move with knowledge that I was unaware, we could bring charges. But Susan didn't stop there. She suggested we take it one step further. If Mark had a history of doing this, even once, we could argue that Judith wasn't just a participant, she was a victim of manipulation. That wouldn't excuse her, but it would give us more leverage in court. That idea stuck with me. Not because I wanted to help her. But because if I proved that Mark had done this to others, I could break him completely. I called Martin that night. I told him I needed a favor. He didn't ask what. He just said, when and where. We met the next morning outside a private investigator's office. The man inside looked like he'd stepped out of a 1970s cop show, big mustache, coffee-stained shirt, tired eyes that didn't blink. His name was Joe. I gave Joe a list of names Beverly had uncovered, 3 women Mark had been involved with in the past 10 years. All older. All divorced. All bankrupt within months of meeting him. I want everything, I told him. Phone records. Real estate. Photos. Talk to the neighbors if you have to. I want to know if any of them are still alive, and if they are, I want to talk to them. Joe nodded once. It'll take a few days. I said I could wait. Back at home, Judith had started avoiding me altogether. She spent most of her time in the guest room, talking quietly on the phone, whispering like a teenager sneaking around their parents. I didn't interrupt. I wanted her to feel safe. Confident. Like her little plan was still hidden. She would get careless. They always do. 3 days later, Beverly called with something big. Mark had filed false insurance claims in 2 states. Both involving properties that mysteriously burned down weeks after they were purchased under different shell companies. No charges were ever filed, but investigators had noted inconsistencies in the reports. Beverly sent me everything. I forwarded it all to Susan. Then I called Joe. He answered on the 3rd ring. I got one of them, he said. Her name's Linda Carpenter. 68. Lives alone in New Mexico. Says she hasn't talked about Mark in years, but when I mentioned your name, she agreed to meet. I asked why. Joe paused. Because she said she always hoped someone else would come for him. The next day I drove 6 hours to meet Linda. She lived in a small house off a dirt road. Wind chimes on the porch. Old rocking chair. She greeted me with a hug like we were old friends. Inside, she poured tea and sat me down like I was her grandson. Then she told me everything. She met Mark 6 years ago. Charming. Smooth. Said he was starting a retirement community and needed investors. Promised her a big return. Said she was special. Said he'd take care of her. They were engaged within 5 months. He emptied her accounts by the 6th. When she confronted him, he disappeared. No calls. No trace. Left her with debt and a house she couldn't pay for. Her kids had to bail her out. She hadn't spoken to anyone about it since. I asked if she'd testify. She didn't hesitate. Absolutely. That man ruined my life. I thanked her. Left with a copy of her sworn statement and a promise from Joe that he'd keep her safe if Mark ever came back. When I returned home that night, Judith was gone. No note. No explanation. But her closet was half empty. I checked the drawer where she kept the passports. Hers was missing. I didn't panic. I smiled. Because I had just pulled the last thread. And the whole thing was about to unravel. I woke up the next morning to an empty house. Judith still hadn't come back. Her car was gone. Her phone was turned off. I stood in the kitchen holding a coffee mug and listening to the silence like it was a warning. But I wasn't afraid. I was calm. Focused. I had waited weeks for them to make a move. Now it was my turn. I called Susan at 7:30 sharp. Told her Judith had left. Told her I believed she was with Mark. She didn't sound surprised. She said it was time to go public. We drafted an emergency court motion. It included all of Linda's testimony, the financial records, the real estate schemes, and the insurance fraud claims. We added the attempt to transfer property illegally and the manipulated power of attorney documents. We sent it all directly to the judge overseeing our case, along with a request for a formal restraining order against Mark Dawson. By 10 that morning, we had a hearing scheduled for the next day. I spent the afternoon preparing. I printed photos. I rehearsed answers. I reviewed statements until I could recite them in my sleep. This wasn't just about winning a court case anymore. It was about pulling them both into the light and letting the world see who they really were. That night, I didn't eat. I didn't sleep. I sat in the garage with my service jacket draped over the chair, the one I hadn't worn in 30 years. I thought about what it meant to fight when you had nothing left to lose. And I realized something. I wasn't just getting revenge. I was reclaiming my name. The next morning, I walked into the courthouse alone. No Susan this time. She was already inside preparing our materials. The hallway was quiet. The same linoleum floors. The same dull echo of shoes. I sat on the bench outside the room and waited. At exactly 9:52, the door opened. Judith walked in. She wore sunglasses, a grey jacket, and heels too expensive for the occasion. Behind her was Mark. He looked thinner, more tense than the last time I saw him. He looked like a man who realized the game was about to end. We didn't speak. Inside the courtroom, the judge took his seat and called us forward. He asked if we were prepared to present new evidence related to financial misconduct and fraudulent manipulation. Susan stood. Yes, Your Honor. And we have a witness willing to testify remotely. The judge allowed it. Linda Carpenter appeared on screen from her home in New Mexico. She sat with her hands folded, her voice steady. She told the court how Mark had tricked her, drained her savings, disappeared. She showed letters, voicemails, bank statements. Judith looked down the entire time. Mark didn't blink. When Linda finished, Susan turned to the judge. We believe this pattern of deception is not only established but ongoing. Mr. Dawson's involvement with Mrs. Palmer has followed the same template. Financial access, emotional manipulation, and ultimately, attempted asset theft. The judge looked at Mark. Would you like to respond? Mark stood. His voice was smooth. Too smooth. He claimed Linda was a bitter ex, said the financial records were taken out of context. Said he had never pressured Judith into anything. Then Susan pulled out the final piece. A signed statement from one of Mark's former business partners. A man named Thomas Keller, who admitted under oath that Mark had used multiple shell companies to hide money and avoid liability. It wasn't just circumstantial anymore. It was a pattern. A method. A career of fraud dressed up as charm. The judge leaned back in his chair. Mrs. Palmer, did you know about these activities? Judith hesitated. I didn't know the full extent, she said. I thought he was helping me. I thought he cared. The judge didn't react. Then why did you file to take over your husband's estate while transferring real property into a trust with Mr. Dawson as beneficiary? She didn't answer. He repeated the question. I was scared, she finally said. I thought Ed was losing control. I didn't want to lose everything. I made a mistake. The courtroom fell silent. The judge spoke slowly. This court finds sufficient cause to grant the motion for a restraining order against Mr. Dawson effective immediately. All assets previously under dispute will remain frozen pending full investigation. The property trust is nullified. Further proceedings will determine financial damages and potential criminal charges. He looked at me. Mr. Palmer, we'll reconvene in 2 weeks to finalize the ruling. Until then, you are protected under this court's jurisdiction. Judith tried to speak again. The judge cut her off. You may wish to speak to an attorney of your own. Court dismissed. I didn't wait. I walked straight out of the building, past Mark, past Judith, past the hallway full of strangers who now knew what they really were. I got in my truck, turned the key, and drove home with the windows down and the wind in my face. Because for the first time in months, the silence didn't feel like a warning. It felt like freedom. The day after the hearing, the house was quieter than it had ever been. Judith hadn't come back. Her closet stayed half empty, her toothbrush gone, her perfume no longer lingering in the bathroom air. I sat at the kitchen table, staring out the window at the yard we had once built together. The grass needed trimming. The flower bed had weeds. But I didn't care. I had bigger things to finish. I called Susan and asked her what came next. She said now we press forward. Civil fraud. Criminal referrals. Financial penalties. We were going after both of them, not just to win, but to make sure they couldn't pull this on anyone else. I told her I wanted to go further. I wanted to bury Mark Dawson. She didn't flinch. Said she would draft everything we needed. But she warned me, if I went for the throat, it would be public. Names, headlines, exposure. There would be no going back. Good, I said. That's exactly what I want. That afternoon I started cleaning the garage. Not out of nostalgia. Out of clarity. I needed a space to work, to think. I pulled down old boxes. Opened up shelves I hadn't touched in years. And there, in the back corner, I found something I had almost forgotten about. A box labeled Army, Letters and Records. Inside were old files. My service history. Commendations. Letters from commanders. But one thing stood out, a photo of me and Martin standing beside a captured intelligence officer. A man we had once helped turn over to U.S. custody after uncovering a ring of traitors inside a friendly base. That memory came back like a flood. I had dealt with liars before. Only now they were wearing nicer clothes. I called Martin. Asked him if he was still in touch with anyone from the local press. He laughed. You want to go public? I said no. I want to go loud. We met the next morning at a small diner on the edge of town. A place where nobody cared who you were or what you were talking about. Martin handed me a folder. Inside were printed screenshots, timelines, financial statements, and a single-page letter from Linda agreeing to speak publicly about her experience with Mark. I took it all and walked across the street to the office of a local journalist named Claire Monroe. She had written exposés on politicians, real estate scams, even a church that had stolen donation funds. She was tough, honest, and didn't care who got uncomfortable. She listened to my story for an hour. Didn't interrupt once. When I finished, she said, "You sure you want this out there?" "Yes," I said. "Every detail. Even the part where your wife helped him?" "Especially that part." She nodded slowly. "I'll run it. Front page. But once it's out, it's out. There's no erasing it. That's the point." 3 days later, the headline hit. Retired veteran uncovers multi-state fraud scheme tied to local businessman and ex-wife. The article included everything. My testimony. Linda's story. Beverly's research. The failed property transfer. The attempted conservatorship. The fake documents. And the history of Mark's bankruptcies and shell companies. It spread fast. By noon, Mark's name was trending locally. By evening, 2 more women came forward with similar stories. By the next day, his condo was surrounded by reporters. I watched it all from home. Didn't smile. Didn't gloat. Just waited. Because I knew Judith would call. And she did. At 8:42 that night, my phone rang. I didn't answer the first time. The second time, I did. Her voice was quiet. Tired. "Why are you doing this?" "You tried to erase me," I said. "I'm just returning the favor." I didn't know what he was. "I swear." "You didn't care." There was silence. Then she said, "It's all gone. Everything. They froze my accounts. They are investigating me. I have nowhere to go. That's not my problem anymore. Please, ED. I made a mistake." "No, Judith. You made a choice." I hung up. I sat in the dark for a long time after that, staring at the phone, listening to the wind move through the trees outside. Then I turned off the lights. Went to bed. and slept like a man who had finally stopped bleeding. 2 weeks passed since the story broke. Mark Dawson's name was all over the local news. Investigations had been opened in 3 states. Banks froze his accounts. His car was repossessed. And from what Beverly told me, he had moved out of his condo and was staying in a motel near the edge of town. The wolf had become the rat. I never saw him again. Judith, though, she tried. She came back one afternoon. Pulled into the driveway like nothing had happened. No warning. No call. Just the sound of tires on gravel and the slow creak of the front gate. I watched her from the kitchen window as she got out of the car, her shoulders hunched, her face thinner, her clothes looser. She looked like someone who had lost everything. And she had. She knocked once. I didn't answer. She knocked again, softer. I opened the door but didn't step aside. She looked up at me with eyes I barely recognized. Gone was the confidence, the control, the quiet smugness she'd carried for years. What remained was just a woman who'd played the wrong hand. "Ed," she said. "Please. I just want to talk." I said nothing. She hesitated, then reached into her bag and pulled out a folder. She handed it to me with shaking fingers. Inside were signed documents. Withdrawal of divorce petition. Confession of fraudulent activity. And a letter to the judge requesting full release of property rights back to me. I looked up. She was crying. "You were right," she said. "About everything. He used me. He lied to me. I was a fool." "You were more than that," I said. "You were willing." She nodded. Didn't argue. I didn't ask her to come in. I didn't offer forgiveness. I just said, "You need to leave now." She did. I never saw her again. The hearing came and went. Susan presented the final documents. The judge granted full control of the estate to me. The restraining orders remained permanent. All investigations into financial fraud were turned over to law enforcement. Mark disappeared from the public eye. Judith filed for bankruptcy. And I? I went back to walking the block every morning. Same route. Same pace. Neighbors started saying hello again. A few of them had seen the article. Some gave a pat on the back, a respectful nod. No questions. Just quiet respect. Martin and I had lunch once a week. Joe dropped off a box with the last of the files. Beverly mailed me a thank you card. Even Susan said she'd never had a case like this one. But the truth is, I wasn't proud. I wasn't happy. I was just clean. Free. One evening, I pulled the old lawn chairs out of the shed. Set one up on the porch. Sat down with a glass of iced tea and watched the sunset across the street. The same sun Judith and I used to watch together. The same light that once felt warm, now just felt distant. But peaceful. The phone rang. It was my daughter, Claire. She'd heard everything, of course. Everyone had. "Dad," she said. "You okay?" "I'm still standing," I said. She paused. "You ever think about moving? Starting fresh?" I did think about it. A lot. But I told her the truth. No. I think I like the quiet now. She laughed. Said she'd come visit soon. I hung up, leaned back, and closed my eyes. 50 years of marriage. 50 years of believing I knew someone. And in the end, all it took was one signature, one plan, one lie too many to shatter everything we'd built. But I didn't crumble. I fought back. Not with fists. Not with rage. With truth. And now, In the stillness of a quiet porch, I found something I hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. Final words? No. This isn't a story that ends with a speech or a final kiss. This ends the way it should. With silence. Because some stories don't need a new chapter. They just need to end.